And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network. Boy, do we have a busy afternoon for you. I'm your host this afternoon, Rachel Stockman. A lot going on. In minutes, we're going to take you back live to the Shaun Harrison trial that's going on in Boston. That's that preacher, the teacher, the dean that was living a double life, allegedly, as a drug dealer and tried to shoot one of his students, execution style. And then we're also going to take you live inside a Georgia courtroom for a case that we followed gavel to gavel, and that's the Tex McIver trial. He was found guilty of felony murder. Now it is his sentencing. So that's going to happen very soon. Busy, busy day. I'm here with one of our regulars, Julie Rendelman, criminal defense attorney and law and crime trial analyst. Okay, let's talk first about Shaun Harrison. This is a case, and my co-host Jesse said it earlier, it really seems like Breaking Bad. Here you have this pastor living a double life, or allegedly. When you look at the evidence, and you're a former prosecutor, it doesn't look so good for him. In his defense, I really haven't seen a clear strategy there yet, other than it wasn't me.
Yeah, I think the strategy right now is to question the credibility of the various witnesses, and obviously these are all students who were involved in the business, so the credibility question is that because they were involved in the business, perhaps they have a motive to lie. The biggest issue to me, or the biggest problem for them to try to overcome, is why would the complainant, the person who was shot, lie about the person who shot him? There doesn't seem to be any real reason why he would be there'd be a motive for him to be dishonest about that, and that's a real hurdle for them.
Or unless he, just to play devil's advocate, unless he said, you know what, he's friends with all these students, and let's bust the teacher because we want to stay, friends. I don't want to get any of my friends in trouble. I mean, it's a possibility.
That seems like a pretty big stretch, for him to. But remember, he's not going after another friend. He's not going after someone he at another school. He's going after the Reverend. So, I mean, that would be a big stretch that he's making it up because of that.
Well, we will see. So it looks like we have, you can see on the side of your screen there, we're live back inside that Boston courtroom. The cop that was on the stand before the break was there. And of course, he was involved with a search outside the Harrison apartment where he found a gun on one of the friends. It looks like they're looking at some evidence, some pictures. Not quite sure. Let's dip in quickly and see if we can get caught up on what's going on in the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston. Let's take a listen. And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network and also to our Sirius XM listeners. Right now, you are inside a Boston courtroom, and we are listening very carefully and watching the trial of Shaun Harrison, who's facing charges for attempting to murder one of his students. Now, he's accused of living a double life, a Jekyll and Hyde, a dean, an English teacher, but also a man who is allegedly running a drug ring. Right now, an officer is on the stand, and he's been on the stand now for several hours, talking about some of what was found in this teacher's house, which I'm here alongside Julie Rendelman, one of our trial analysts. This is not what you typically find at your teacher's house. Marijuana, weapons. I mean,
no, that's not the normal thing, especially the preacher-teacher that we talk about. Yeah, look, I mean, this is unfortunately a tedious part of the testimony, but the jury has to hear it because eventually we assume it's all going to come together. But this is pretty bad evidence for the defense.
So when they were searching this preacher's apartment, they found guns, ammunition, marijuana. Here's something really interesting, that he apparently had a mural of the Latin Kings gang in his apartment and a gang tattoo.
Sure, which is obviously relevant because we know from some of the witnesses that he bragged about his association with the Latin Kings. So this just corroborates some of what they said.
And, you kind of wonder how this all began, right? Like, was he a teacher to begin with, or was he a gang member that said, you know what, I have a great way to further my drug ring. I'm going to become a teacher, become a dean, and get mixed up with at-risk youth and recruit them as part of my ring. I mean, it's kind of genius if you think about it.
It sounds like he had been investigated before. There were some reports that indicated they had been surveying him, but they had not found anything because there had been reports of drug activity. So it's interesting that this came to be. And it's interesting that the school had him working with them, and one wonders, how they made their choices in regards to who
because I know, and I think
students.
Yeah, I always wonder about that because from being in high school, I'm sorry, but rumors spread pretty quickly, and a teacher that's selling drugs, that's recruiting students to sell drugs. That doesn't stay a secret for very long. The rumor mill spins in high school.
Yeah, and I don't think he'd been there, but I think he'd only been there since, 2015. So, perhaps he chose those students who he thought would keep their mouths shut.
Very interesting. Okay, on the stand right now, Sergeant Richard Medina. He's with the Boston Police. You can see him right there. He's been on the stand now for several hours. And what they're doing, and Julie used the word, maybe tediously, entering each and every piece of evidence, showing it to the jurors, including a few minutes ago, we saw the rather large weapons and some of the different weapons that Harrison allegedly had, and also they apparently did find some marijuana too. They thought, I think I heard them say they thought he also had cocaine, but they weren't able to corroborate that. Certainly a very, very interesting trial in many respects, but again, we're going back to this defense, and we'll see where they go when it's the defense's turn. But basically, Harrison's saying it wasn't him. Okay, it looks like the sergeant's talking, so let's take a listen. And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network, and a special hello to our Sirius XM listeners. Right now, we are inside a courtroom in the Boston area, and a sergeant from the Boston Police is on the stand, going through very meticulously all of the evidence and the crime scene that was collected during the shooting. And of course, right now on trial is a man by the name of Shaun Harrison. He was a teacher in the Boston area, a preacher who's accused of living a double life, who had a Jekyll and Hyde personality. That's what it's been characterized as. And he is facing charges of attempting to kill his student, Julie. Very interesting here. It's going a little bit slow for the jurors, but some of this stuff they really need to get in.
Yeah, they need to get it all in. I mean, this is a witness that's testifying not just to being at the scene of where the Reverend was arrested, but also at the crime scene where the actual attempted murder took place. So the jury needs to see the evidence. Now, one would expect the prosecutor to be a little more organized because the jury is going to start to be bored by it and not pay attention, which is something you don't want as the prosecutor. But hopefully once they get through this, some of the evidence will come together and the jury will be able to pay attention more, and the prosecutor will be a little quicker in getting to the point.
And we'll certainly see who else the prosecution plans to call this afternoon. Okay, so we're going to keep a very, very close eye on that trial. We're going to take you back inside that courtroom in just a minute, but let's go to a quick break. Everybody, to the Law and Crime Network and to our Sirius XM listeners. I don't want to waste too much time because we're live inside court. This is the case of Shaun Harrison, who's facing charges of trying to kill one of his students. He was a teacher in the Boston area who is accused of living a double life and running like a drug ring on the side where he'd actually recruit his students. We've said this time and time again. This is a story like it's out of a movie. Right now, we have a sergeant with the Boston PD on the stand, and he is being cross-examined by Harrison's defense attorney. Let's take a listen. All right, we are inside the trial of Shaun Harrison, a Boston high school dean, a teacher, a pastor who's accused of living a double life. His other life, his darker side, he was allegedly, according to prosecutors, a drug dealer. He ran a drug ring, Julie, Rendelman, and then tried to assassinate, execution style, one of his students. That was unsuccessful. The student was able to live and tell his story, and that is why we are inside this trial right now. But I want to do a little explaining because it's getting a little bit confusing. So right now we have Sergeant Medina on the stand. He's with the Boston PD. And he's talking about another incident where after the shooting happened, he was in plain clothes and surveying the Harrison apartment and saw these three guys leaving Harrison's apartment. And that's when he frisked them, it sounds like.
Correct. And it sounds like he recovered various items, drugs, the like, from them. They were arrested. There must have been a hearing at some point prior to this trial, and the judge found that the items were inadmissible, and therefore, if they were inadmissible, they would have to dismiss the cases against these three individuals. I assume the basis of it not being allowed in was that he didn't have a basis, whether it be probable cause or reasonable suspicion, to search these individuals, and you can't just search someone. So
basically it was an illegal search. Okay, so that's
Exactly.
a little context. So let's go. It looks like Sergeant Medina's talking right now. This is cross-examination, so it might get a little testy. Let's listen. And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network and to our Sirius XM listeners. We're inside a Boston courtroom for the trial of Shaun Harrison, who is a local pastor and a teacher. Actually, he served as dean of students, accused of living a double life as a drug dealer. And get this, he allegedly recruited his students to do his dealing for him. Now he's facing a trial because he, according to prosecutors, tried to kill one of his students over basically a drug interaction gone bad. I'm here alongside Julie Rendelman, and we have Sergeant Medina on the stand. He's been on the stand now, Julie, for several hours. This is cross-examination. Where are we going with this?
I don't know yet. I mean, look, anytime, I don't know what the defense's strategy specifically is, but obviously they're going to try to question the credibility of everyone. One of the issues this officer does have is he has a tendency not to remember certain things. At one point, he didn't remember whether the gun was loaded or whether or not it was not. So, there's certain things that if you can question his credibility, it starts to bring into question perhaps whether or not he's accurate about certain aspects that point to this defendant being the person that committed this crime.
And also, this is the same officer who conducted what a court later found to be an illegal search of three people that were associated with Harrison, who had also been charged in relation to this case. However, a judge threw out the charges against those three men because the judge found he shouldn't have done that search. He shouldn't have frisked them like he did. Now, this is a very interesting case. We're going to continue to closely monitor it. Unfortunately, we have to take a quick break, but we'll be back in just a minute. And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network. I'm your host, Rachel Stockman, and we are also going to give a special welcome to our Sirius XM listeners. We're going to take you straight live back to court. Shaun Harrison is on trial. He is a local teacher in the Boston area accused of trying to kill one of his students after, get this, a drug deal gone bad. This man just wasn't your average teacher or preacher or pastor. He was also, apparently, according to prosecutors, a drug dealer. Right now on the stand, Sergeant Medina from Boston PD, and he's talking about going to Harrison's apartment and seizing things from inside that apartment, including guns, marijuana, other items that your regular teacher probably wouldn't have. Let's take a listen.
And that, crime scene unit.
Crime scene response unit?
Yes.
And Do you know if the sneakers or the jacket were sent for testing anywhere?
I do not know.
You don't know. And Mr. Bradley was asking you questions about other items, things that were recovered in the apartment. He showed you an envelope that you said was recovered, correct? That you said was addressed to Mr. Harrison?
I didn't recover that. I don't. But yes, that was in the apartment.
But there was also mail addressed to Dante Laura recovered at the scene, correct?
That is correct. And that was in the, yes.
Correct.
Yes.
And will the Commonwealth agree that the return for the search, that no money was seized or listed? I'm sorry. From $165 from the sneaker box and the bedroom. Anything else? Agreed, nothing else? Yes. All right.
Whatever you agreed upon would be helpful in
That
the
was agreement.
service.
The agreement was $165 recovered from the box, in the sneakers box in the bedroom, and that's the only money that's listed in the return.
Okay.
Mr. Brett, you're aware that a search warrant was executed on a storage locker in the basement at 18 on Petty Street, correct?
Yes.
But you weren't present for that, correct?
That is correct.
At some point, you came into possession of some bags, is that correct?
Yes.
Plastic bags.
Yes.
Correct. And was there anything in those plastic bags?
Yes.
And you took what was in those plastic bags and put them in another set of plastic bags, right?
Yes.
And the plastic bags that you took from what you suspected was marijuana out of, those bags were sent to the crime lab for fingerprint testing?
For Leighton, yes.
Anything else?
No, that was it.
Anything else you want me to ask? Thank you.
Redirect?
Yes. Mr. Carroll asked you a question about Dante Laura's paperwork in the apartment or mail, is that right?
Yes.
If I may approach?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that the mail that was recovered addressed to Mr. Laura?
That is correct.
Okay. And I'd ask that this warrant is an exhibit.
Any objection? Objection?
Maybe we should see it sidebar, Judge.
I agree.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network and to our Sirius XM listeners. We're inside a Boston courtroom where a teacher in the Boston area is on trial for trying to kill one of his students that he had allegedly recruited to be involved in this drug ring he was part of. Crazy, crazy case. We're going to take you back there in just a minute after this short break. And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network. We have a very, very busy day, and you are looking right now at a ceiling. Yes, very fascinating ceiling in the Boston area. And it is an interesting case that we're following there. A man who was a teacher in the community, who was a guy that mentored at-risk young students, is facing charges himself for allegedly trying to kill one of his students. And we've been inside that courtroom all day, and we'll take you back there. It looks like they went to lunch, which is why you saw the ceiling there. But when they start testimony again, we'll take you there. We're also very closely monitoring another interesting case out of the Georgia area, and that's the Tex McIver murder trial. Well, the trial is actually complete. He was found guilty of felony murder, but now today is a very important day in all of this. He is going to be sentenced, and we're probably going to hear from perhaps some of his relatives, people that will plead to the judge to give him leniency. This is a mandatory sentence, though, so there's not too many options for the judge. In the meantime, as I mentioned, a lot going on in the crime world across the country, so let's take a listen. And poor Michael, he can no longer live in his parents' basement any longer. It looks like the judge said he has to move out. No firm date, Julie Rendelman, when he has to move out. But you know what? We're going to ask him some of these questions about this case, okay? Because he's going to be appearing here on the Law and Crime Network, and we're going to discuss with him this eviction. He fought it in court. He was pro se, representing himself. What do you make of this case?
I think that he's a big boy and needs to get a job and get out.
Oh, Julie.
Sorry, those in our
Come on,
in the back
maybe
there who
he hit a rough patch in life. Maybe he needed to stay with his parents for a little while.
He did need to stay for a little while, and then it's time to move out.
All right, no mercy. No mercy with Julie Rendelman.
No mercy on this one.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we are covering many high-profile cases across the country today. And including in that is the Tex McIver case. And we're following that one out of Atlanta, Georgia. And we expect to bring it to you very shortly because it is Judgment Day for Tex McIver. He's going to be sentenced. Julie, I don't think there's much choice here for the judge, right?
No.
I mean, this is a mandatory life sentence. He was found guilty of felony murder. Is there anything that can be done at the sentencing hearing? Because we usually hear from family. I mean, there is an option of parole or no parole, so that's something the judge will have to consider.
Right, and the only thing we had talked about earlier, is it possible that the judge can evaluate the evidence that was brought before the jury and make a determination that the jury got it wrong and find for a lesser charge? It's possible. I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, we had some disagreement. I found the judge to be somewhat pro-prosecution. I think other people viewed it differently. But I think that I think there's going to be eventually an appeal process after this is all done. to see if they can fight to get him either a new trial or get some lesser charge.
And I got to tell you, Julie, and we both read this article in the local paper in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. One of their, Bill Rankin, who I actually know from working there, he's a very, very good court reporter. He talked to a lot of the jurors, and it's kind of shocking if you're the defense attorney because how they processed this case. First off, they were all shocked by convicting this man, Tex McIver, of felony murder, that he'd face mandatory life. They didn't think that would be the case. Right. Second of all, it sounds like this was really a compromise verdict and that many of the jurors didn't actually think he was guilty of murder. Now, of course, without going into too many legal technicalities, they found him guilty of felony murder, which under the law is the same thing as murder.
Right, and I look. I mean, the worst thing you can do as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, in many ways, is hear what the jury has to say afterwards. Sometimes it can be helpful because there can be potential appeal issues that come from what goes on in that jury deliberation process. The jury's not supposed to know what the sentencing is because they're supposed to make a decision based on the evidence and only on the evidence. The problem here is that it sounds like from several of the jurors they weren't making a decision based on the evidence. They were making a decision based on the fact that they wanted to resolve the case because they didn't want to make it. In fact, I think one of the jurors said, it cost the prosecutor so much money, we didn't want to make them have to litigate it again. We thought this was our job to make a decision.
This man's life, his freedom is on the hook in this case, and the jurors are saying that they made a decision based on the fact that they didn't want the prosecution to have to retry this case. Very quickly, for those of you that maybe don't know this case, I want to just give a quick recap. Okay, Tex McIver, who you see there right on the screen if you're watching this, he was a very, very prominent attorney in the Atlanta area, and he was married to a very high-profile woman in her own right, Diane McIver. She was a CEO. You can see there a picture of the happy couple. Well, Tex McIver was facing first-degree murder charges for allegedly trying to kill her in the back of the car when they were going home one night from an event. Now, he said it was an accident. They were in a bad neighborhood. He asked for his gun. He was someone who carried a weapon. He asked for his gun. He fell asleep, he said, and he said it accidentally went off in the backseat of the car, going through the car seat, hitting Diane McIver. She died. Interesting. In this case, the jurors convicted him not of the first-degree murder charge, but of the felony murder charge and the underlying aggravated assault charge, I believe it was, Julie. So now what the judge is going to have to decide is his sentence, but this particular charge comes with a mandatory life sentence. So the question is really parole. It's a very interesting case and very controversial case.
It certainly is, and I think that there's been a lot of surprise came out of this verdict. And I think Aaron Keller even wrote an article that was right on point in regards to why the final verdict of the Tex McIver jury didn't make any sense because, and I think we even interviewed one of the jurors on here, and what she described as the decision-making process didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so a lot of people are looking at this case and wondering if Tex McIver really got, or Diane McIver for that matter, got the justice he or she deserved, because it doesn't seem like they were following the evidence when they made their decision.
Very interesting. We're going to take you live there in that courtroom in just minutes. In the meantime, another big case we're covering is the Shaun Harrison case. That's out of the Boston area. He was that teacher, the pastor, the mentor to all these at-risk students in the Boston area who apparently lived a double life and was a drug dealer and maybe a gang member and was recruiting students to do his bidding for him and deal drugs. He's on trial for trying to kill one of his students, and that student, on the first day of trial, took the stand. Take a listen. So the motive here, slumping drug sales. So this teacher went out and killed one of his students because he was not selling enough drugs?
Tried to kill him. I mean, look, remember, he had brought in these, like, a group of merry men, which were the students. And I think probably what he was thinking is that at the end of the day, no one's going to believe that he's involved in this. They're going to believe that these boys are involved with the fight together and that they were, by the way, keep in mind there's cameras that show several of the young men attacking the victim. So in a sense, he could argue these are the ones.
There it is.
These are the individuals that are responsible for attempting to kill this young man. And I think that he was foolish in believing that they were going to buy his version of events and not the young men's version of events.
And one of the people that took this stand was someone by the name of Kevin Perez, and he was a student at the school, and he says that the defendant, his teacher, Shaun Harrison, tried to get him to sell drugs, but he wouldn't go along with it. Let's listen to some of his testimony. Okay, so this is a witness on the stand, Kevin Perez, who was a student of the pastor, Shaun Harrison, the teacher who's on trial for trying to kill one of his students. And if you were listening to that testimony very carefully, you heard him say that the Reverend told him that he was planning to shoot Luis Gonzalez, who's the victim in all of this. However, this is cross-examination, so the defense attorney was really trying to get at the fact, Julie Rendelman, that, well, if that's true, why didn't you go to the police? But these kids are, I mean, they're dealing with drugs here. I don't think it would be your first inclination necessarily to go to the police.
And I think prosecutors usually will prepare the jury for the understanding that the individuals that are going to be testifying in this type of case are not, I was going to make a joke and say they're not necessarily nuns and preachers, but in this case, look
they
look
are preachers.
But, the individuals that you're going to get to testify are those that are involved in potentially some of the outlining crimes. And so they're not the type that are going to run to the police. And that's the reason that the Reverend felt that he could tell him, because he knew he wouldn't be going to the police with that information. And so, obviously the you need to cross-examine about that, but I don't know how much water it's going to hold, how much weight it's going to hold with regards to the jury.
Okay, so let's continue to listen to some of the student testimony, because this is really interesting. This next clip is from Jose Nova, and he's a student. He met Harrison while at school, and he confirms that the two would smoke marijuana together. Again, this is a teacher at a school that's actually mentoring at-risk youth. Let's take a listen. Welcome back, everybody, to Law and Crime Network, and a special hello to our Sirius XM listeners. We are in many courts across the country today here on the Law and Crime Network, as we always are, many high-profile, interesting trials. You're just listening to some testimony in the Shaun Harrison trial. He's a reverend who's facing charges of trying to kill, he's also a reverend but also a teacher, of trying to kill one of his students that was involved in an alleged drug ring that he was kind of in charge with. We were just listening to testimony from Jose Nova, who's a student in his school, talking about meeting the reverend, how he went to anger management courses, and how he ended up smoking with marijuana. I mean, obviously, these aren't great witnesses, Julie Rendelman, to have when, you're trying to put yourself up as some kind of reverend teacher in the community.
Right. I mean, I hate to use the word like birds of a feather, but, a lot of the witnesses say that, when you saw the Reverend, you saw some of these young men in his office. I mean, the teacher that testified said that she saw the Reverend when the attack happened, and he was acting as though nothing was wrong with and not intervening in any way. So all these things, coupled with the testimony of these individuals as to what the Reverend did and said, is very, very, very damaging to the defense.
But, of course, they do have credibility issues, and if we're to believe the Reverend, he wasn't the one that actually pulled the trigger. So we'll see what the defense puts up. But in the meantime, I want to switch really quickly to another big case we're about to take you live into, and that's the Tex McIver trial. He is a very prominent Atlanta attorney that is going to be sentenced today for felony murder, killing his CEO millionaire wife. How this all went down when we come back. Okay, if you're listening on Sirius XM, you didn't see his reaction there, but I can describe it for you, Julie Rendelman. He didn't actually seem that surprised. You know, he didn't really react. He was a bit stoic. But this verdict, as someone that had been covering this trial gavel to gavel with us, it was a pretty big surprise to all of us.
Well, it was shocking. And, you know, it's funny that you say he didn't react, because one of the issues that happened during this trial was there was constant comments about his reaction, and so it kind of bodes well for the defense that he didn't react, because I would assume that he was devastated when he saw or heard what happened, but he didn't show it. And so it's funny that that became like even an issue, you know, that he was pretty stoked, because that's kind of who he is.
Yeah, and that was one of the pieces of evidence, and I put in quotes, okay, that the prosecution tried to say, well, this is why he's guilty, because, you know, if someone's wife had just died, they're going to react X way and going to be upset, and he wasn't upset enough. Take a look at the police interrogation video. He doesn't seem very dismayed.
Exactly, which I thought was nonsense. I guess some of the jurors didn't, but I thought it was absolute nonsense to assume that an individual has to act a certain way in order to grieve for a loved one.
And I've said this before when we cover some of these trials, when either the prosecution or the defense goes there and tries to say someone's not reacting appropriately to a certain life-changing event, I always think in the back of my mind, desperation, right? Like, that's kind of, like, if you don't have any good evidence, you're going to go with that. If you have the ballistics, you know, if you have the motive really clearly written out, you don't have to go to the reaction factor.
But I think we talked about this, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to disagree with us, but a lot of people agree with us, that I think that we always felt throughout this trial that there was a lot of desperation, not just with that, but many of the pieces of evidence that came in, desperation to try to prove that this individual was guilty of an intentional murder. The jury obviously didn't buy that. I don't know what the jury bought, because I still don't understand what the verdict means. Because
so if you read this article that's out in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, it makes it really clear that the jurors were kind of hung on this, and they probably would have come, you know, they would have come out with a verdict if not for the pressure, feeling like they really had to. There could be some appellate issues with that potentially.
Sure, and you know, one of the things that they've said, which often you hear, is that we had no idea what the sentencing was going to be. Had we known, we would never have found him guilty of that second charge, because, you know, they naturally assume if it's not the premeditated or the first-degree murder, it's that felony murder in the middle, you're probably going to assume that, wow, it's going to be a lesser sentence, so they're more comfortable with it.
Of course, because jurors aren't lawyers. They don't know that felony murder under the law in Georgia is the same thing as murder, and he faces a mandatory, this man who says he accidentally shot his wife, faces now mandatory life in prison. This guy is not getting out unless he somehow convinces an appellate judge to overturn
and he's not
the
a
jurors.
young man either.
No.
So this could potentially, I mean, we talk about life. It's a life sentence for him, and it's there's some questions I think that we're all thinking about with regards to whether or not justice is really served.
Okay, so in preparation, because in just minutes we're going to take you live inside the sentencing hearing, I expect us to hear from perhaps friends, relatives of Tex McIver, trying to convince the judge why this guy needs mercy and should be eligible for parole. However, if you're just getting caught up in this case, let's take a listen. Let's go way back to the beginning of the trial and take a listen to the prosecution's theory of this case. Remember, the jurors bought into this. Let's take a listen. Okay, so that was actually the closings from the prosecution, and why we played that particular clip, and that's kind of important, is she was really going over the components of aggravated assault and felony murder, and that is what Tex McIver was found guilty of. Of course, this is the case of an Atlanta attorney who was charged with murdering his CEO millionaire wife. He says it was all an accident. I'm here alongside Julie Rendelman, Law&Crime trial analyst. So really, the jurors, I guess, really bought into this aggravated assault charge, or at least they didn't buy into it. They thought that that was a good compromise to what they thought.
I wonder, because I think most of us wonder, whether they really understood what this felony murder meant. Not just what it meant in terms of sentencing, but what it actually meant.
Right.
Most of the jurors thought that it was involuntary. And
Reckless.
I think one or two of the jurors thought that it was the top charge. And so that's where they came to this middle ground. But when you analyze the definition of this felony murder, the jury would have to believe that he intended to seriously physically injure his wife, and that was by no means what the evidence that the prosecutor was bringing forth was showing in any way. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Their argument was that he wanted to kill her. There was no reason he would want to just injure her and have to deal with the idea that he would have a wife that was potentially, God forbid, an invalid that he would have to pay for and care for.
It makes no sense.
So it makes absolutely no sense and doesn't match what the prosecutor's theory was in any way, shape, or form.
So what Julie's basically saying is, even if the jurors bought into the prosecution's case that he wanted to kill her because he was after her money, which is basically their case, why wouldn't they find him guilty of the murder, but instead find him guilty of the intent to injure, but not murder? So I guess the question is, why would Tex want to injure her so she could live to tell the story, right? It makes no sense.
He wouldn't, and that's why people are so dumbfounded with this jury verdict. And I think the jurors themselves, after hearing at least from that article, I understand it's an article, and so we don't know, we haven't heard specifically from certain jurors, but we've heard from at least one that when asked about the specific elements of that crime, didn't understand what they were. And so that speaks volumes about what the jury really understood. Some jurors even questioned the judge's Allen charge, or that charge to get them back in there and, you know, making a determination as to the verdict itself.
But here's the thing, Julie. Here's the thing. The defense in their closings actually explained that aggravated assault is kind of the same thing as murder because it requires intent. I hope we're not getting too weedy here. Let's take a listen quickly to the defense's closing, at least a little clip as we wait for this to go live. Okay, we're just listening to a little bit, a clip there of the closing arguments from Tex McIver's defense attorneys. I thought they were pretty strong closings. I know this attorney personally from living in Atlanta, and he is considered to be one of the best in the area. But it was all for naught, Julie Rendelman, because unfortunately for him and his client, Tex McIver, the jurors deliberated, I think, for maybe about 28 hours and came back finding him guilty of felony murder. Of course, he was accused of intentionally killing his wife. Local attorney, he said it was an accident. We're going into sentencing now. I mean, I have to say, you know, the defense gave a pretty strong closing.
They did. The prosecution also gave a very strong closing, I have to say. You know, I think that I don't recall the female prosecutor's name, but she was actually, I found her riveting, subtle, calm, together, and really put the pieces together. Now, again, I disagree with what those pieces were, but I think she did a really incredible job. And many say that the prosecutor's rebuttal was pretty incredible, or pretty exciting as well.
It certainly was. And I think we're going to get our feed any minute in the sentencing hearing for Tex McIver. We're going to take you live there as soon as we get it. But first, a quick break. And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network, and a special hello to our Sirius XM listeners. We have a lot going on this afternoon here on the Trial Network. A lot of big cases we're following. One is the Shaun Harrison case out of Boston, and as soon as we get a feedback there, we will. This is the fascinating case of a reverend who was allegedly living a double life as a drug dealer and would recruit his students to deal drugs from him, and then he tried to kill one of them, according to prosecutors. So if you want to watch that trial, head to our website. In the meantime, in the meantime, excuse me, the main trial we are focused on is the Tex McIver trial, and you can see a live feed if you're watching us on the Law and Crime Network. There it is. You can see folks are gathering. This is a big day in the life of Tex McIver, an Atlanta attorney who was convicted of felony murder for killing his CEO millionaire wife. He says it was all an accident. The jurors, though, found him guilty of felony murder, which was a lesser charge. So he wasn't found guilty of the highest first-degree murder charge, but they did have what has been described as somewhat a compromise verdict. I'm here alongside Julie Rendelman. She's a law and crime trial analyst, and she also has been following the Tex McIver case. As we see from that live shot we were just showing, people are gathering. What do we expect in these kinds of sentencing hearings?
We expect to hear from loved ones of the deceased, in terms of how they feel about what Tex McIver took from them. And then potentially we'll hear from the prosecutor, we'll hear from the defense attorney, and then we may hear from the defendant. He has a right to speak as well. And then obviously at that point the judge would give his verdict.
Okay, let's
give his verdict, give his sentence.
His sentence. And at this point, because it is a mandatory life, really the question is parole or no parole.
Right.
I'd assume that he probably will make him eligible for parole because this is a guy that has never been convicted of a crime before. And, there are some questions as to how this whole case unraveled. So wouldn't you expect that probably...
Yes, some leeway. Yeah.
But he, I believe, is not eligible for parole for 30 years.
Right.
And I think he's maybe 70 years old.
The only question I have is I do wonder, in certain states they allow for someone to remain out during the appellate process. I don't know if they would in this case. But that's one question I don't know the answer to.
Okay, so here you go. You're looking inside the courtroom in Atlanta, Georgia. This is Fulton County. I actually worked for several years as a reporter there, so I'm very, very familiar with this courtroom. And you can see, looks like the various parties. Oh, there's Lewis, who's a camera guy for a local station that I used to work at. I know him. But they're all gathering. I can see Tex McIver's attorney there. And I'm sure in just minutes, I was told about 5 minutes or so, that this hearing is going to get underway. Usually, when we deal with sentencing hearings, they're a little emotional, right? Because this is a time when you actually get to know Tex as a person. The judge allows the people who testify to kind of talk about the more emotional side of how this has impacted their life. And it's different than when we're in a trial and there's strict rules of what's allowed to be admitted and not.
Right. I mean, there has to be decorum in the courtroom, and so the judge certainly doesn't want to hear yelling.
I'm sorry.
Whoops.
Sorry,
Whoops.
sorry, folks. That was my Siri that just started talking. My Siri's really excited as well for the sentencing to begin.
See, we're all just...
We wanted to begin because...
chomping at the bit.
This is a case, honestly, that we all were very, very interested in and very surprised by the verdict. So... while we wait, and we're going to keep a very, very close eye on the courtroom right there. And as soon as anything happens, I promise you, you're not going to miss anything. We're going to take you there live. In the meantime, though, in order to really give context to this case and make it so you can understand it, we played a little bit of the defense's closing. We played some of the prosecution's closing. Now, this is a really colorful and dramatic rebuttal by Clint Rucker, who's a prosecutor in this case. Again, Tex McIver was on trial for murdering his wife. Take a listen to the prosecution's closing rebuttal. Okay, welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and a special hello to our Sirius XM listeners. We are live right now inside a courtroom in Fulton County, which is in the Atlanta area of Georgia, and in just minutes, any minute now, we are going to begin the sentencing portion of the Tex McIver case. Tex McIver, local attorney in the area, pretty prominent attorney, did pretty well for himself, was facing murder charges for killing his wife, who was a actually pretty prominent woman herself in the community, was a CEO, was a millionaire. The state said it was for financial motives. He was after her money. Tex McIver maintained and always has maintained that it was because it was all an accident. He didn't mean to shoot her. There they are, the happy couple. I'm here alongside Julie Rendelman. It's going to be interesting because sometimes during these sentencing hearings, the defendant himself will speak, right? Tex McIver.
Sure.
And, you know, the judge always likes to see that you are sorry and you can't believe this happened. But in this particular case, if he's really maintaining that this was an accident, he didn't mean to kill his wife, you're the defense attorney. What do you advise him to say to the judge?
It's such a great point, and I don't know if there's an easy answer because, of course, you want the judge to give you sympathy. But since the judge has so little room or so little wiggle room in terms of his decision making, I'm not sure he needs to be that remorseful, especially when his position is that he didn't intend to kill her. And so if he didn't intend to kill her and the jury found this verdict that is against what he believes, I don't believe you're certainly not going to hear him say he apologizes for intentionally killing his wife or intentionally assaulting his wife.
I certainly think he's going to probably, if he does speak, probably say something to the effect of, I'm sorry that this situation happened every day of my life. You know, I have to deal with the death of this woman that I was in love with.
Right.
And all indications, what's kind of crazy about this case is all indications, every single witness that testified said that they had a pretty loving, good relationship. That's why it's so puzzling to me and other trial watchers out there why the jurors would have found he would want to murder her. Well, not murder her, but intentionally try to harm her.
Right. And I think we've all walked away with more questions than answers with regards to this case. And look, I was dumbfounded at the time. I admit that I'm still a little dumbfounded. And after listening to some of the jury's comments, I'm a little more comfortable in terms of my belief that this jury got it wrong.
Well, you know, again, there's always the appeals process, and Tex McIver's attorneys, from what I understand, have, of course, said that they're going to do that. And when we talk about the jurors specifically and that 28 hours of mystery deliberations, what goes on behind those closed doors, we've gotten a little bit of an inkling coming out heading into this hearing that, to be honest, the jurors were a bit confused themselves about what all this meant, specifically as it relates to the law behind this.
Right, and remember, the jury's not supposed to know what the sentencing is. And the reason they're not supposed to know what the sentencing is they're supposed to decide the case based on the facts and not based on what they think is the appropriate time an individual is in jail. And so, you know, the fact that they didn't know that is not that's certainly not a rise for an appeal issue. I think the issue becomes the fact that many of the jurors were saying that the basis of them making the decision was not because they thought he was guilty, but instead because they thought it was the thing to do because the case had gone on so long that it was their job to make that decision and get it done. And that in certain ways they may have felt obligated by the judge that they were required to come back with the decision.
Well, but see, that very issue there is what could potentially be meat for an appeal, which is that there was a certain instruction, perhaps the jurors were a bit confused with, that they felt like they had to come to some kind of verdict and maybe didn't really realize that there was an option of being hung?
Exactly, and the defense made an issue of that and objected because they wanted the judge to include some language indicating that it was acceptable for the jury to, in certain circumstances, if they had done everything they could to come back with a hung jury. He refused to. So, look, this, as long as many other, may be some issues for potential appeal.
Okay, so we are inside right now. All the parties are gathered. The gallery is pretty full from what I can see inside the sentencing hearing of Tex McIver. He is that man, that attorney in the Atlanta area who was found guilty of felony murder for killing his CEO, millionaire wife. He says he didn't do it. This is critical. This is his sentencing. We'll take you live right after this break. And we are back live here on the Law and Crime Trial Network and also being listened to at Sirius XM Channel 109. Thanks so much for joining us, especially our listeners and, of course, our regular viewers here on the network. A lot going on, as I mentioned. We're inside a courtroom right now. This is in Fulton County, Georgia. Tex McIver is going to be sentenced today. And guess what? He's going to end up, Julie Rendelman, spending a lot of time behind bars. Now, just to review the case a little bit, for those of you just joining us that might not know, Tex McIver was found guilty of felony murder for intentionally trying to injure, but she ended up dying, his wife in the back of a car. They were going home from dinner, and they kind of drove into a dangerous area of Atlanta, he claims. He was in the back seat of the car right behind her, and he asked for his weapon, which was in the console, the center console, and then he says it went off accidentally. But Julie, that's not what the jurors found.
Right. I mean, the evidence, I think what the prosecution tried to show was that he intended to kill her, and the basis of that, or the motive was for money. And they spent a lot of time during this trial establishing that he was in debt, that at least trying to establish that she was worth more to him dead than alive, although I think we all question that, but that the motive was that he would stand to inherit a lot if she was no longer there.
And again, you're looking at some of those pictures. If you're just listening to us, we're showing pictures right now of the trajectory of the bullet into the backseat of the car. And that was really something that the defense kind of harped in on, which was, if he really wanted to kill her, why did he shoot at that angle? She did die from her injuries, but there probably would have been a more exact angle to hit her either right in the head to make sure that she did die, because really he was taking a risk by shooting at that angle if he did so intentionally.
Absolutely. He also was shooting through he was shooting through the back of a seat. And so there's no guarantees that it would have gone straight. So I think we're back.
Yeah, it looks like, so we're now, if you're just joining us, we're inside this courtroom in Atlanta. You can see the judge, who we all know very well from watching every single day of this trial. You kind of feel like you get to know the judge and just by watching him. He has taken his seat, and my guess is the jurors are going to be called in any moment. They're going to be brought in any moment. Oh, what am I saying? Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm losing it here. This isn't a trial. No, I'm so used to saying that because we're always covering trials. Right. So that was just kind of like my reflex going.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's some jurors in the audience.
There could be jurors in the gallery, but this is a sentencing, so it's the judge's call here. Interesting, because the judge was sitting there for every single day of testimony. He knows this case very, very well. He knows the law behind it. You know what? It looks like he's talking, so let's dip right in and see what he has to say. Okay, wow. We just heard from Danny Jo Carter, critical witness in this case. She was there when Tex McIver pulled the trigger, killing his wife. She just gave her victim impact statement in the sentencing hearing. Julie, she says that Tex McIver lied to her, and I mean, she's angry at this man.
Yeah, she is. I mean, look, he did make a lot of serious blunders, including try to impact her in terms of what she recalled. But again, I don't think that changes the facts on the ground, which is that this was not an intentional murder.
Well, and again, he was found guilty of felony murder, and we just heard from several people who were really kind of testifying on behalf of the prosecution, giving their victim impact statements, including Danny Jo, who said that Tex McIver lied to me over and over again, and this has been such a horrible incident in her life. And she said, thank you to all of those prosecutors who stood up for justice. Okay, right now, who is speaking? Defense attorney for Tex McIver. It looks like she's going back and forth with the judge. Let's take a listen. All right, that is it. That was the sentencing hearing in the Tex McIver trial, sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. But Tex McIver is no young man. That likely means he will probably die behind bars for the felony murder of his wife, Diane McIver, who was a local CEO in the community, a very prominent woman. We heard from several people during this sentencing hearing, including victim impact statements from Danny Joe Carter, who really blames Tex for a lot of that. You can see Tex, there he is. He looks it's kind of sad to see. He looks kind of pathetic there, all in his prison garb. He's being taken into his cell where he is going to stay for a very, very long time. We're going to have more analysis on this trial. We have to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll talk more about the Tex McIver sentencing. Stay with us.